Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. So today I want to talk about Jack's book, an oral biography of Jack Kerouac. So what this book is basically, it's a biography about Jack Kerouac, but it's told through a series of interviews that the authors had with various people who knew Jack Kerouac, people who were involved with the Beat Generation. And with all these excerpts of interviews, they kind of tie them together with their own analysis of what was going on in Jack Kerouac's life and the greater context of the Beat Generation. So through all these interviews, it kind of tells Jack Kerouac's life story in a very journalistic way of writing. And this is actually my second time reading this book. I read this book probably about 14 years ago. It was actually the first Jack Kerouac related book I read after reading On the Road. So this time around, I have all this other research and reading I've done since then. I had a lot more context going into it. I think it took a lot more away from it this time around than I did before. I think this is honestly the best Jack Kerouac biography that's out there. It's a really good, well-written book. But what I like about this book, and the very opening idea that the book presents, is that as readers, we hold expectations on writers to represent the time that they wrote about. And Jack Kerouac's a perfect representation of that idea. Because the Beat Generation, really, the way this book describes it, was a created idea based on the literary movement of all these different writers in America. Because people basically took this discontent for post-World War II America and attached it to these group of writers that are known as the Beat Generation. And, because the Beat Generation, it's not that many writers. It's, Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg. So America really just took these feelings, discontent, and attached them to these writers and had these writers represent, what they felt going on in America at the time. So the first part of Jack Kerouac's life that this book looks at is obviously his childhood. And I think what this book does by giving a very vivid and descriptive analysis of his childhood is that it shows that Jack Kerouac really saw the world through his childhood, the rest of his life. He kind of saw the world with this lens of childhood, and that's kind of what made him become such a great writer. He just had this very childlike way of looking at the world. And I think even though his childhood helped him write about his life later on in life, I think it reveals that there was a lot of things that happened in his childhood that he wasn't able to really move on from, because his childhood was a very chaotic childhood. I mean, he talks a lot about how, he has a lot of nostalgia for his childhood, but throughout his childhood, his family was always moving around the town of Lowell, Massachusetts. They moved from house to house as his father moved to different jobs. So he never really had a very, permanent home. And his parents were French Canadian, so he kind of saw himself as being French Canadian. So he didn't really see himself as fully American. So he didn't really feel fully American. He was always on the move, moving from house to house. So he never really had a place where he could establish real roots. And growing up being a Catholic as well, he also saw the world through the lens of being a Catholic. And I think that through his Catholic faith, he saw life as being a story of suffering. And because of that, he kind of tended to dwell on bad things that happened in his past and just really let those bad thoughts kind of fester in his brain and just build up over time. And especially it talks about how the death of his brother had a big impact on him. And after his brother died, he kind of had this saint-like way of looking at his brother. He kind of held his brother as this kind of mythic figure in his life that was lost. And I think because of that, he kind of spent his rest of his life searching for this sense of childhood innocence that he lost very early on in his childhood. And after it talks about his childhood, it talks about his time in New York City after he moves to New York during college and how he very quickly became involved in this underworld of New York City. And he wasn't really, I would say he was more of an observer of this underworld. He wasn't really too active in it. I mean, he made friends with people like William Burroughs, Herbert Huncke, and all these people who were, involved in this very underground scene. But he was still very much an outsider in this underground world of New York City. He mostly just spent his time observing it and writing about it. And in his first novel, The Town and the City, he kind of took these two experiences of his time in the New York City underworld and his childhood in Lowell, and turned it into this novel, A Town and the City. And that book gave a very vivid description of those two worlds. And after The Town and the City was written, he turned that ability to analyze the world and looked at America as a whole. So that's kind of where On the Road picks up. It kind of took this ability to really analyze his past, analyze his environment, and just look at his America as a whole as he traveled around it. So this book really looks at Jack Kerouac's life during the events of On the Road. But I would say that this book doesn't really, it looks at his life during On the Road, but it tells the story of On the Road through the perspective of people who knew him. It tells what was going on during in Neil Cassidy's life and Carolyn Cassidy's life, people like Ginsberg and all these people that he knew. It kind of tells On the Road from their perspective. But it doesn't go so much in detail about exactly the events of On the Road, but it tells the story of the events that were going on around the events told in the story. So really this book's a good supplemental book to read after reading On the Road, because it kind of fills in all the gaps of things that weren't told in the story itself. And I also really like how this book is told through the perspective of reflecting back on the events of On the Road, because this book was published 10 years after Jack Kerouac had died and almost 30 years after the events of On the Road took place. So that really comes through, I think, as this book's really people reflecting back with a sense of nostalgia on the time that Jack Kerouac wrote about. And this book is also obviously told through spoken word to an extent. It takes interviews of people and transcribes it into this book, and so you're really getting the story through the actual perspective of people. And the way the writing is, it kind of, you feel like you're having a conversation with the people who you're reading about, or telling their perspective on the story. And that's kind of the way On the Road was written. On the Road is written as this, you feel like Jack Kerouac is telling you the story himself. So the way that this book uses interviews to tell the story of Jack Kerouac's life, it's very similar to the way that On the Road itself is written. And I also thought it was really interesting how Neil Cassidy's perspective is left out of this book. I mean, obviously Neil Cassidy was dead by the time this book came out, so you weren't going to get an interview with Neil Cassidy, but I think that's very representative of who Neil Cassidy was, because Neil Cassidy was kind of this mythic figure in the Beat Generation. They kind of, looked at him as holding all these ideals that they felt, whether or not they were, true or not. So he was kind of always this mythical figure in the Beat Generation. It was always just kind of, his myth was what was bigger than him. So the way that he doesn't exist when this book was told is kind of, I think, very reflective of who he was as a person and what his impact was on the Beat Generation. And I think by having a lot of people who knew Jack Kerouac, people who were involved in the Beat Generation, talking about him, giving their opinion on him, it gives really good, I think, analysis of what the Beat Generation really represented. And I think what the Beat Gen represented, it was this search for America outside of America. Basically, they were looking for America, but they were searching for something that didn't really exist. Because in Jack Kerouac's travels throughout On the Road, his travels around America supersede America itself. They go to Mexico, he has this French-Canadian background, so he kind of looks at America as North America itself. Not only were they looking at America itself very differently, they were searching for ideas that weren't very mainstream in America, and they took those ideas and applied them to their life within America. Like Jack Kerouac is very into Buddhism, Allen Ginsberg is very into Hinduism, so it took a lot of ideas that weren't mainstream and used them to try to find meaning in their lives, meaning in America. And that's what I think the Beat Generation really represented. It was a start of culture in America starting to look for something different, looking for something that wasn't the traditional story they've been told their whole lives. Because Jack Kerouac, he was born a Catholic, he was raised Catholic, and he slowly adopted many Buddhist beliefs throughout his life. But I feel like that shift for him going from being a Catholic to kind of identifying as being a Buddhist represents how America was going from this very Christian nation that we all know of America being in the 1950s, and starting to go in a new direction that we saw in the 1960s. And Jack Kerouac himself, I think, really represents that transition. But I think more than anything else, what the ideas of the Beat Generation do, they really take all these threads of different ideas in American counterculture, stretching back to early American history, people like Thoreau and Walt Whitman, and takes all those ideas, all these different ideas of discontent with American society, and kind of ties them all together to create the Beat Generation. That kind of lays the groundwork for the rest of American counterculture to take off in the 1960s. So with the Beats being this generation that's looking for meaning, looking for a sense of purpose in their lives, and people like Jack Kerouac being people who literally wander around America, I think that the Beat culture itself was a culture that moved around, because they tended to all move together. They started in New York City, they all kind of relocated to Denver, then they were relocated to San Francisco, and they went to Mexico City, and they kind of just followed each other around. Particularly, they seemed to follow Neil Cassidy. Neil Cassidy was this person they all idolized, so they tended to all cluster around wherever Neil Cassidy was at the time. So the Beat Generation was really a generation of mobility, a generation that could really move around America, and that had a lot to do with the highway system that was built in America during that time. But they were definitely a generation, or a literary movement that moved around and constantly relocated. Just like Jack Kerouac's life. I mean, he was constantly moving during his childhood, so the literary movement that he became involved in was a movement of movement. So obviously this book here is very on the road centric. It focuses a lot on the road. It also gives a very good description of the writing process, the struggle to get it published, and it talks a lot about his struggle with fame, which I've talked a lot about in other videos I've done on Jack Kerouac. But I would say that one thing I didn't like about this book is that it relies too heavy on the story Big Sur to tell. Talked about Jack Kerouac's downfall. Because when it talks about on the road, it's telling it through the perspective of other people who didn't necessarily tell their story, during On the Road. But with Big Sur, it kind of just talks about the events of Big Sur that you already know if you read the book Big Sur. So I don't think I took a lot away from the way it talked about Jack Kerouac's downfall. I mean, it's a story we all know. We all know how fame ultimately destroyed Jack Kerouac, and does a decent job talking about it, but I just think it focuses a little too heavily on Big Sur. But as this book talks about the legacy of On the Road, the legacy of Jack Kerouac, it had one thing that I really found interesting where it said that legacy on the road isn't really the book itself. The legacy is Jack Kerouac, the man, the person. When the book became popular, it wasn't the book itself that became popular, it was Jack Kerouac that became popular. So he kind of became this cultural icon, but in the same time, not really the author he wanted to become, even though he was a best-selling author, very famous author, but he became more of a cultural icon than an author. And this book talks a little bit about why On the Road became such a good book, what was happening in America that allowed it to become so popular. And there's one passage in this book that I wanted to read out loud. I think it really represents why On the Road became such a popular novel in America. And it's talking about Dean Moriarty's car. He drove a Hudson. And it says, "The Hudson of On the Road was a familiar symbol to them. The streamlined car that every GI under Ike's command had promised himself when the war was done and the factories had finished manufacturing guns. Every Sunday after church, the family got in the car and drove to the country. The son of the family could look forward to the day when he got the keys to the car from father, because for most young men, the expansive back seat became the first couch of love. But every Sunday, it was necessary at some point to turn around and go home. Every drive-in date was a deadline mission. Dean Moriarty was different. The road, not the suburban driveway, was the place for the car. Nobody sat waiting for Dean's girls to be home by midnight. Dean didn't turn around at 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. He kept going." So I think what this kind of describes is that, everyone in America, they knew what a car was, knew what the road was, but it kind of took, these two symbols, the road and the car, and kind of made people look at it differently. The road was this place that kept going. It wasn't just, your driveway and going to church, going to school, going around town. It was this place that you could go and just go all the way to Mexico and just keep going. So On the Road really redefined what the idea of the road meant to America. And I think it really gave people nostalgia for a world they never knew, because this book took place in the 1950s, and people who lived in the 1950s weren't really aware of this underground culture that existed of people, traveling around America. So it was kind of, I think, interesting for people to read this, knowing that there was this other world in America that they weren't even aware of that was going on at the same time. And I think another thing that this book makes very clear is that Jack Kerouac is a very conservative person. I mean, you look at Jack Kerouac and you think of him as being the very beginning of counterculture in America, the first hippie, but he really wasn't. He was a very conservative person deep down inside, and he really resented the direction that counterculture went, in the 1960s. Because Kerouac was someone who supported McCarthyism, supported the Vietnam War, and that just goes against all these central ideas of counterculture in America. So he really didn't fit in these, stereotypical ideas of what, someone involved in counterculture represented in America. But I think at the same time that Jack Kerouac talks about, this discontent that people felt in America during that time, I think this idea of discontent goes a lot deeper than people realize, because obviously, the counterculture movement, the New Left was born out of that, but I think the New Right was also born out of that. Because Jack Kerouac wasn't a political person. He didn't really look at America, in terms of politics, in terms of left and right, but he really represented this central point in this split that happened in America, the start of the culture wars that, birthed the New Left and the New Right. But he really wasn't a central figure in that. He just lived in that time period. He really represents, I think, this discontent in America that went both ways. It wasn't just the counterculture, of the New Left that, was born from this discontent. It was also, the New Right. And they also lived within this discontent in the 1950s and were searching for meaning. I think the only difference is that with New Right, they really, I think, looked at the 1950s with nostalgia, in a very different way. It was going back to a time before America lost this culture that they missed. Because I think post-World War II America was really the point where modern American culture was born. And it was a very chaotic place, it was this place of conformity, but underneath all that, this new culture was starting to form that wanted to take America in another direction. And that's where I feel like a lot of our modern American culture really came from. And Jack Kerouac's a good representation of that America. But yeah, overall, enjoyed this book. It's definitely, I think, the best biography I've read about Jack Kerouac. Definitely would recommend it. Like I said, it's a good supplemental read if you're reading a book like On the Road or another one of Jack Kerouac's major works. So yeah, that's Jack's book. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next book review.